Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Oxford Wine and Spirits podcast. My name is Tom Brady, and each week we'll be talking to our friends in the industry about the subjects that we find fascinating. The subject of today's discussion is finding beauty in bitterness, and anyone who knows me knows how much I love to go on and on about all things vermouth, amaro, and bitter liqueurs. But today I'm going to shut up, for the most part, and let the experts do the talking. I'm coming to you right now at the beginning of February, just as so many of us are sacking off what I can only assume has been a long and drawn-out dry January. For me, it was a dry New Year's Day, followed by a moderate January, but then we had the Oxford Whiskey Show, so any plans of sobriety went right out the window. But I wanted to begin this wine and spirits themed podcast in a slightly controversial manner by airing an interview that goes into a reasonable amount of depth on the current trend for no and low alcoholic drinks. My guest today, Claire Warner, has a wealth of experience, not just in the Amaro category, but also in that of zero ABV spirits, and it was fantastic to get her take on the links between the natural reactions caused by bitterness compared to that of alcohol. I spoke to Claire in the summer of 2023, so we may mention the weather being slightly nicer than it currently is. And that aside, I hope you enjoy this conversation. Claire Warner, welcome to the podcast. Today we are talking about beauty and bitterness. In other words, how bitter liqueurs, Aperitivo culture, and cocktails like the Negroni and the Spritz all come together to create something absolutely wonderful. Claire, the reason I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today is that you're probably one of the most informed and concise people I've ever met when it comes to talking about this topic. So I'd like to start by asking how you got to this point, your career in the drinks industry to date, and what it was that first sparked your interest in the subject.
Well, Tom, I'm blushing. Thank you for that nice introduction. I have been working in the drinks industry for a long time. I've been a bartender, I've been a brand ambassador, I've been a brand developer, liquid developer, and sort of the last 20 years have been really dedicated to drinks. But the last sort of 5 or 6, I've really spent in the wonderful world of Aperitivo, because I created a non-alcoholic brand called Acorn, which is a sister brand to Seedlip. And that was very much a celebration of bitterness and Aperitivo culture and all that good stuff. And the only real difference was that it didn't contain alcohol. But we took a lot of inspiration from European Aperitivo culture, and then, dug really deeply into the history books to try to find a way to link what was happening in Europe in terms of the development of Aperitivo culture and what those liquids represented, and try to find sort of some synergies with what was happening here in the UK at around the same sort of time, so sort of 16th, 17th century. And so became a bit of a bitterness geek, I suppose. For Acorn, we discovered that acorns were used in the Middle Ages as a digestive aid because they're very bitter. And so that's how we linked what we created for Acorn as a UK aperitivo to this country and what we were doing in this country back in the sort of Middle Ages. So there was some sort of nice sort of synergies there. But I think it's as a topic, bitterness or the flavour is actually a very polarizing flavour and often quite challenging and quite intimidating for a lot of people. So I like to talk about why that is, physiologically, psychologically, and help people learn to enjoy what that category can represent. When we think about bitterness, we think maybe, Campari or maybe Aperol, but, tea and coffee are bitter as well. So, that they don't tend to see people sort of screaming for the hills. So, I think it's all about, building confidence and helping people understand just what bitterness can do in many different ways, but also just how beautiful a category of products or flavored ingredients it can be, not just in drinks but also in cooking as well. So it's been an interesting journey, but I just wish more people would kind of come to bitter liqueurs, aperitifs, vermouths, or bitter flavor with a bit more of an open mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I was actually hosting a tasting recently where we had 12 in the room, and it was an Amaro tasting, as it happened. And I think I had 11 people utterly engaged, totally into it. And I had one person who I think at one point commented, "How did your wife ever agree to marry you with tasting drinks like this?" So despite that, I've been so pleased to see that in recent years, we've seen a really interesting shift in drinks culture compared to sort of 10, 15 years ago, when some of the most called for cocktails in bars across the UK were things like strawberry daiquiris and porn star martinis and kind of sugary disco drinks, to the 2020s, where I'm absolutely delighted to see articles online about the Negroni being the number one cocktail in the UK right now. It's music to my ears, quite frankly. Have you noticed this? And what is it that you feel has kind of changed in the United Kingdom for people to be starting to be drawn towards these drinks more readily?
Mm. It's a great question. I mean, fundamentally, bitter flavors are probably more interesting, more compelling, a little bit dangerous. They make us feel something more than just the level of alcohol that's in them. So I think that there's probably been a real shift towards slightly more classic styles of drink, which are more spirituous, so moving away from the longer styles of drink or the mixed drinks. Although, having said that, the margarita is probably the other number one selling cocktail in the world. So,
With good
but
reason.
those sort of, yeah, exactly, it's a great drink. But those sort of like citrusy, fresh, bright, sessionable drinks are delicious. Um, when the environment or the moment is right. But I think we were sort of perhaps inspired by Mad Men or inspired by so many of the brilliant cocktail menus that were being produced by the Erics and the Agos, people who are really flying the flag for those sort of bright, bitter, complex drinks. And the Negroni is also one of those cocktails that is pretty difficult to mess up. I mean, I know I've had a few bad Negronis, but it's really only 3 ingredients, equal parts. So it's one of those rare drinks that can cross over into something that you can also make at home. So there's probably a lot of drivers that have contributed to the rise of these sorts of drinks. But I think just culturally, we have been moving towards a sort of more bitter preference in this country. If you just look at the types of lettuce that are available in the supermarket, and I'm not sure if you remember, but when kale was really popular, we were all
Yeah, of
eating
course.
tons of kale. So we drink a lot of coffee in this country. I think now we drink more coffee than we drink tea. So that palate shift has been happening over the last probably 10 to 15 years, probably linked to a greater awareness of health and well-being, understanding that these ingredients, not just in drinks, also can actually have a lot of functional health benefits. So, we're getting used to or building a tolerance for more bitter and enjoying more bitter flavors. And the enjoyment part is really important because bitterness really does work at a sort of functional level to trigger your endorphin system. So you get a lot of rush of sort of pleasurable feeling when you eat, drink bitter ingredients. So I think all of those aspects combined has led to us feeling more confident to enjoy these drinks. I think the other aspect, just taking the Negroni to one side for a second, the rise, this sort of exponential, explosive rise of the Aperol Spritzy drinks, very ubiquitous in this country at, this time of year. You can't really move for those, bright orange goblets. So, that has really, again, made us super excited by this category, and wanting to experiment within it. So, your sort of starter drink maybe is the Aperol Spritz, and then you gravitate towards maybe, Campari soda, and then perhaps you might experiment with a Negroni. So once you get into the category and you start to understand just the scope and the range and the breadth of it, then it's super exciting. And it's not just Aperol. There's so much more that you can explore and be excited by. So yeah, all of those sort of drivers, I think, have made bitterness the most interesting and most exciting category of flavour that we've seen over the last few years.
Fantastic. I mean, the spritz is such a powerful thing. Whenever I do an Amaro tasting, people are always asking, well, which cocktails would you put these in? What mixes well? And I always just start by saying, just stick it in a spritz. It's usually a lower ABV,
exactly.
easier to drink. Fantastic. So we're talking about bitterness on the rise, but what is it that you feel has made bitterness historically something that people have backed away from?
Well, I think it's really about self-preservation, because historically bitter things would have alerted your body to potentially being poisoned. There's absolutely no poisonous natural substance in nature that's sweet. So all poison is very bitter, and our poor ancestors would have needed to experiment and potentially die as a result to understand which plants and which herbs we could eat and we could enjoy, and that maybe were also beneficial to us. So while there are many, many poisonous plants that are bitter, there are some that, the dose makes the poison, right? So, if you eat a small amount of them, they have really incredible functional benefits for you. And then, at the lesser end, lots of vegetables and plants are a little bit bitter, and that's because the plant is working hard to protect itself from insects, so it kind of naturally will release some sort of bitter tasting chemicals. But to our taste, once we overcome sort of the shock of the bitterness, or we cultivate them to be less bitter, which we have done over the last few years, then we can enjoy them for what they are, really delicious plants, herbs, etc. So, we approach bitterness still, I think, from that psychological perspective or that physiological perspective of this is going to be harmful, and that is often the first reaction, and that is why bitterness triggers the endorphin system, because your endorphin system is your body's pain management system, and that's what kicks off when there's a little bit of pain, the sensation of pain will kick off your endorphin system. So that's why sparkling water will have the same effect, or something spicy or something bitter. Your body has this rush of hormones to deal with what you've ingested, or also to deal with what you're doing. So endorphins also are triggered by running or laughing or gossiping or singing. There are body's way of sort of protecting us, but also create these lovely feelings within us. So we want to go back and try these again. So for me, it's interesting that bitterness kicks off the endorphin system, because there must be a point where there is pain associated with consuming these bitter substances, but there's also on the other side of that pleasure. And so I think as human beings, we kind of like to have that dance. We like to walk that line between pain, pleasure. And so there must also be an adaptive, positive response to eating and drinking better things, because it feels good, and so therefore it makes us, and it must also be good for us. So I make the joke that when you think about eating and drinking bitter things, and that your body has this natural response, so therefore eating and drinking bitter things must be good for us. That isn't to say that Negronis have a nutritional value, and that the more Negronis or the more Aperol Spritzes you drink, the better it is for you. But I think it's important to note that if you take alcohol out of a lot of these bitter drinks and you enjoy bitter drinks without the alcohol, you will still get a lot of the same endorphin response that you would get if you were drinking something alcoholic. Alcohol has a huge endorphin triggering effect. So, for me, it's really important when we were looking at ways to access the aperitivo category without alcohol that we still gave people the same sort of physiological, psychological response. And one of the great things about endorphins is that they make you feel connected and bonded to the people that you're having that experience with. And very often when we're not drinking, we feel as though we're being left out. But if you can find a delicious non-alcoholic bitter drink, you'll still get a lot of those same responses. So that's one way that you can continue to feel included in that great experience.
Wow, I mean, speaking as a spirits buyer, I think, well, that's something we're all going to have to start dealing with in 2023, is being able to recreate those experiences without the alcohol. Maybe not all the time, but certainly maybe on a Tuesday night. I don't.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, moderation, that's key.
Absolutely. So, I mean, talking about getting used to bitterness and sort of training yourself almost to get to the point where you can move past your kind of instinctual reaction to shy away from something. Do you think it might be? Do you think someone who's adamantly adverse to bitter drinks could teach themselves to fall in love with something like Fernet Branca, or do you reckon that's a step too far?
I think, that's probably diving into the deep end. I actually wasn't a huge fan of bitter drinks until I met my husband, who really likes Negronis, and so, I kind of joke that love made me do it, and I was like, I will learn to love a Negroni, and so, continue to sort of drink them through not liking them. But then all of a sudden you're like, actually, this is a delicious drink, and you find the balance and you find what people are raving on about. But I think, firstly, there are some people that, bitterness will always be really difficult to enjoy, because if you are considered to be a super taster, then these very, very extreme flavors will be unbearable. So I have a friend who literally cannot taste anything that's too spicy, too anything really. She's very much like, likes plain food. And perhaps that's because she's got a very, very sensitive palate. So of course we have to make space for everybody when they're in a bar. And if people don't want to experiment, then that's great. And there's always a delicious pina colada, or there's also always a delicious, I don't know, cosmopolitan on the other side of the Negronis and the more complex drinks. But I think that, yes, if you're not a super taster, you absolutely can build a tolerance. And the more you drink, the more of a tolerance you build. And I think in many ways, the more you enjoy these drinks, the more bitterness you want to experiment with. It's kind of like if you want to have a hot sauce, Tabasco is not going to cut it anymore. You want to go hotter than that. And, so there's this tolerance that we build up. But I think there's also a psychological response to, well, what's more bitter than Aperol, or what's more bitter than Campari? What else is there that's not just about the bitterness, right? Because I think there's loads of other flavors that come along with these bitter liqueurs. There's bitterness for me is just about the sort of structure and the backbone and the power. But there's also other sort of more subtle ways to enjoy, bitter, slightly bitter vermouths, which are, a bit more herbal or more delicate, more floral. So you don't have to go straight into the big punchy stuff, Fernets. Even I'm not keen on Fernet, but that's because it ruined Christmas for me one year. So I've got that sort of memory. But so I think, yes, start by introducing a splash of something bitter. Really talk to your bartender about what they have, because it's not just about the big brands that often we can find something that is particular to us. We're often talking about those very big, popular, famous Italian aperitivo brands, but there's more subtle, sort of more delicate styles that come from France, and also Italy as well. So really sort of talk to the bartender, and if you're wanting to cultivate this palette for bitter flavors, then experiment and start with things that are slightly sweeter, slightly more floral, just with a hint of bitterness, and then sort of work your way up to the big boys and girls.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things I love about tasting through different vermouths and amaros is the nostalgia element that comes into it. I mean, the number of times I've tasted something and I've been taken back to different sweets that I've had as a kid, or even Coca-Cola. So many times I go, yep, there's a bit of Coca-Cola in there, I'm sure, or something akin to it. So you're absolutely right. I think it's really, really important not just to focus on the bitterness and actually appreciate what wonderful drinks these are on their own merit. But yeah, so I'd like to switch things up and talk a little bit about aperitivo culture. So this is something that is huge and has been huge for a long time, not just in Italy, but across. I just wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit about the link you feel there is between aperitivo culture and these bitter drinks.
Great question. I think we really sort of we create the culture of aperitivo was really very much about a place and time. So it's mainly attributed to sort of Milan and Venice and that sort of cafe culture, and also in France, where there was a sense of like sitting, watching, promenading. These sort of very light in ABV drinks, also quite bright and eye-catching, and crucially would work well with the types of food that was being served alongside them. So if you ever are lucky enough to go to Venice, you'll see this in action, the cicchetti and the small, tiny, bright, bitter drinks that are served alongside. And I think it's very much about sort of culturally wanting to have a moment at the end of the day, when work is over, to help you switch gears into the evening. So it's about relaxing with your friends. It's super social. It was always about, the end of the day, one or two drinks, not about getting drunk, but one or two drinks, a small snack, and then preparing you for a much later dinner. So obviously in Europe, they eat a lot later than we might here. And so they're very much about a moment in time with your loved ones, or with, in fact, maybe even people you don't know, but there's super social part of the day, where work is behind you and the evening is still ahead, which is why, very often we talk about the golden hour or aperitivo hour, which that moment is, really preserved for switching off, getting, reacquainted with friends, or making new friends, or, just watching the world go by with small dishes and small plates and small drinks. And we don't tend to have something similar here. So that's why it's quite tricky for us to kind of culturally get what this is all about, which is why I really encourage people to go and experience it for themselves in Europe, not just in Venice, but many small or large European towns, villages, cities will have this moment where time seems to slow down, and work is done, but the socializing now is the important part of the day. And so something about the bitterness also stimulates the appetite, helps prepare you for food, helps prepare you for the food later on. That endorphin rush creates bondedness, so you do feel relaxed and you do feel connected to the people you're with. And I think here we sort of like rush from work to the pub, and we're very much sort of destination drunk here. We want to drink with a particular destination in mind, whereas in Europe I find that food and drink are sort of culturally very interlinked, and they're all about the moment and slowing down and how these drinks can like complement the food, whereas food and drink still, I think, to a certain extent here are quite separate still. So there's not a lot of there are some great pubs here, of course, that serve delicious food, but in Italy and in France and in other sort of European countries, they really prioritize the quality of the food that's served alongside those drinks. So it really is, a cultural moment that we struggle to understand, because perhaps it's colder, so we're not so likely to sort of like want to sit outside a cafe and have a little drink and a chat. So that's why we're rushing straight to the pub. But I think it would be really beneficial for us to take some cues from how the Europeans approach eating and drinking, because socially it really does make such a huge difference.
And of course, you've done a lot of research yourself into what bitterness does to the mind and to the body in this kind of scenario, right?
Exactly. And this is what I think is so important about what these drinks represent, with or without alcohol. So firstly, with alcohol, they're always intended to be lower in ABV. They are typically lower in strength than your vodka tonics, your gin and tonics, those sort of other cocktails. These are sessionable drinks. They're intended to be consumed, and then you don't get wasted on them. They're sessionable drinks. And then without alcohol, they can still be very much enjoyed in the same sort of way, because those classic European liqueurs, aperitivos, vermouths are so chock full of botanicals and flavour, and they're already lower in strength. Once you take the alcohol out, you can still very much have a really delicious, well-made, complex, multifaceted alternative that doesn't really miss the lower strength alcohol at all, so you don't feel like you're missing out. But emotionally, socially, culturally, these moments where we slow down and we really prioritize spending time with our friends and each other are super important. And as I mentioned, in Europe, that is a cultural priority, whereas here, less so. We rush to get out of work and into the pub. And it's super important that we're sort of rushing to get into these places to connect with one another, as opposed to, rushing to these places just to have a pint. We are experiencing sort of epidemic levels of loneliness, and I would love to see more of us sort of prioritize those really important people connection moments in the same way that they do in Europe, because that for me is where this is so important. Whether you're drinking or not drinking, coming together over little drinks and snacks is what makes us human.
It's a really interesting distinction to make, and I would look at Aperitivo Culture and then sort of head out into London at 5:30 and see people spilling out of pubs and kind of draw a bit of a link. But you're absolutely right to say there is a difference there. I think the times when people eat probably makes a big difference as well. I think there's definitely a rush to sort of get 1 pint in, 2 pints in, and then make it home for dinner or something like that. Whereas I think if you go somewhere like Spain or places closer to the Mediterranean, that meal, the restaurants aren't even opening until 8:00. Yeah. So there's definitely time to slow down and rest. I think it's quite ironic that when you go to France, they actually call this period after work. Rather than using a French word for it, which always amuses me.
Yeah. I mean, that and I think that's a celebration of like after work. It's surprising they haven't got a more elegant term for it, but we do rush that time, whereas in those sort of like European countries, that there's a real determination to slow down and to make almost time stretch. Whereas we're like rush. So culturally quite different in that respect.
And do you see signs of changes in the UK? Do you think we're slowly starting to emerge into a more easygoing, more aperitivo forward country, or do you think we've got a way to go yet?
I definitely think we've got a taste for aperitivo culture in terms of food and drink, because you can't move for all of the types of, tapas or, small dishes, small plates that you tend to, there's quite a trend for that, I think, now. And, as we've already talked about, there's a lot of Aperol being served in this country. But I think what is exciting is that there's a sort of new wave of really great, delicious, new aperitivo brands that are coming out. I'm thinking specifically of these days drinks, for instance, who really put a focus on using natural wines and natural ingredients, and a much higher quality type of drink that the more discerning consumer is probably by now looking for, because there's been such a ubiquity of those big brands over the last few years. So I think, yes, we're definitely seeing a trend, sort of move from a trend into being something much more mainstream. The fact that we've talked about Negronis being so mainstream now, and people perhaps also, I think during lockdown, I can't remember, there was so much talk on Instagram or socials around, Negronis, and Stanley Tucci making his Negroni and shaking it. There's like a whole, there's a sort of cultural crest of conversation around, those styles of drinks, which has moved them now from something niche into something more mainstream. So I think, yeah, that hopefully, we'll see more moderation follow, which is definitely also a trend, and hopefully also linked to that some sort of slowing down and enjoying that other side of aperitivo culture. But I think what we're seeing sort of short to midterm is perhaps a little bit more diversity in those categories. So other brands that aren't so ubiquitous given a chance to actually be more popular, become more popular, because there is such a groundswell of interest around, those big Italian brands, and consequently there should be a spillover for that consumer to try and find other things. And we do love to drink in this country. So if you're a brand that's looking to connect with that consumer, you've got an audience that is really looking for something perhaps different, and something that's more natural, or lower in ABV, whatever. So I do think that we're moving towards a greater appreciation of these styles of drinks, less sort of running away crying because it's too bitter, much more leaning in and sort of celebrating like these delicious bitter drinks.
Fantastic. And for anyone listening who might be keen to go out and start experimenting with some of these drinks, off the top of your head, is there any brands that you could recommend people go out and get their hands on?
So we've already talked about these days. For me, things like unexpected things like, chartreuse, which is a wonderful herbal liqueur with, as various levels of bitterness. But I absolutely adore chartreuse. Really great New World vermouths. So Regal Rogue, for instance, which also uses natural wines and natural Australian wines, and they're a little bit more on the subtle side. Chinar is a sort of classic and doesn't sort of perhaps get as many mentions as it should because it's so delicious. But I think, go to your liquor store and just look at all of the different bitter aperitivos and vermouths that are on offer. And, they're really beautifully packaged. There's such a style to many of these brands. So pick one that just looks interesting and, give it a try. And, like you said, Tom, the best way to enjoy many of these drinks is with just soda. So again, it's something that you can do at home that's super approachable and easy to create something delicious. So they're some of my favorites.
Fantastic. No, yeah, ripe for experimentation. I mean, I'm totally with you with the chartreuse. I think the Last Word cocktail and all of its iterations are probably some of my absolute favorites and kind of number one go-tos when I go to a cocktail bar for the first time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you on that. And then of course, absolutely just going and experimenting. And I think I've said before as well in some of my tastings that part of the joy of particularly vermouth and amaro is the wonderful labels, they
Yeah.
take you somewhere, they take you to a place and really help you kind of discover this whole culture behind what it is that you're drinking.
I think they travel very well, and one of the reasons why they became kind of quite popular, there was a sort of explosion in the late 1800s, was that, you know, those brands, I'm thinking, you know, vermouths, very provincial vermouth brands or very provincial Amaros, you know, they were very much of the place. You know, they were using local herbs and botanicals. They were a taste of that place. And so if you were traveling there, you know, you would bring some home with you, and you would, you know, it's a bit like sort of, a bit like the more sophisticated version of like a limoncello. You know, wherever you go, you might bring something back with you to enjoy at home. And that's why they sort of in many ways enjoyed this proliferation, because they do give you that taste of the place and the provenance like no other. I think they're so local, they're so immediate, they're so, you know, this is what my local area tastes like. And so for that reason, they can be nostalgic as well, because you can remember that great time that you had in the Alps or wherever it might be.
And they're so easy to communicate as well.
Yeah,
I mean, I love
yeah,
the story about Punta Mez, where the guys came up with it based off of the stock market going up 1.5 points, and they were
yeah,
celebrating. And then it got to the point where, on a busy evening, they just had to show their fist and then swipe their hand, uh, doing the
yeah,
Punt Emez
the,
sign, and the bartender would know exactly what it was that they wanted to drink. There's
yeah,
so many of these stories, and it's such a wonderful culture to kind of delve into and research and bring up on podcasts and at dinner parties and situations where you're drinking these wonderful drinks.
exactly. Because I
So
think
yeah.
when you're sharing this information with people who are perhaps not from our industry, that there's a real you know, there's a because there's so much misinformation, or there's not enough information about these brands, there's a sort of hesitancy or an intimidation. So I would really encourage people to like lean into learning about some of these styles of drinks, because once you get a taste of it, there's so many different expressions, there's so many different experiences that you can have. You know, if you're on holiday, you know, what should you be drinking that's sort of local to the place in Europe in particular, that you can get a sense of, you know, what they make locally. Because they very often be in this sort of like aperitivo style or aperitif style in Europe. So I love to sort of like drink random things that, you know, a waiter or bartender will recommend while I'm traveling, because some of those brands don't travel back to the UK, so you'll always be really excited by, you know, the offer, in a different way to like a wine or a spirit. You know, these things are so representative of where they come from, that I really encourage people to yeah, so get stuck in.
Absolutely. I mean, my poor wife is used to now, whenever we go and sit down at a cafe or a restaurant somewhere in Europe, I just step up and go, I'm just going to have a little look at the back bar first, and then just peek and whatever looks interesting, just point at it and say, could I have some of that, please?
Think,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. I think the server loves that. I was in Venice a couple of weeks ago, and I asked for puntanes and soda, just sitting out at the cafe, and the bartender was like, actually, no, let me recommend this. And I was just looking for the brand. He recommended something very local, and it was like a bitter sort of Coca-Cola, like maybe with a dash of like cherry Coca-Cola thrown in there. Oh, it was just insanely good, you know, with soda. And if I could remember the brand, you know, I'd be googling it now, because I'm just thinking that would take me back. If I was to have that at home, it would take me back to that moment, you know, sitting in a cafe in Venice. So yeah, I do think that we should encourage people who aren't in the drinks industry to have those types of experiences, because we tend to do it because we're a bit geeky in that way. But I think bartenders really love to show off what is local and what is unexpected and unknown, versus, you know, the sort of big brands that are, you know, global household names.
There's so many other benefits into drinking locally and supporting local businesses and things like that. So at the very least, you're going
100%.
to be doing a good thing for the place that you're visiting.
Yeah, exactly.
Claire, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me today. I really, really appreciate all of your insights and your wealth of knowledge and your enthusiasm for the subject. It's hopefully we've managed to light a fire underneath some people and encourage a few people to go out and experiment and try some things for themselves. So yeah,
Yes.
thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Tom.
So there you have it. Thank you, Claire Warner, for your time and insights, and we can't wait to get you back on the podcast again soon. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do drop us a like, subscribe, and more importantly, recommend it to someone who you think might enjoy it too. I've been Tom Brady, and this has been the Oxford Wine and Spirits Podcast.